Greg Cosell is an author and NFL analyst. He's a filmmaker. He is also the senior producer of NFL Matchup Show. Hello, this is John Ricciutti, and we're on location at NFL Films as a guest of Greg Cosell. We are from Radnor Studio 21 in Wayne, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia. Greg, thank you very much for giving me the time. I certainly appreciate it. It was most generous of you to have me on here.
John, it's my pleasure. I'm glad you made it out. And Radnor 21, that's my age, by the way, 21. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that. Is there anything I missed in the introduction?
Probably not. I mean,
No.
I guess we'll get into that as we talk.
Okay.
I've been with NFL Films, by the way. This will be my 36th NFL season coming up. We talk here at NFL Films in seasons, John, not in years. This will be my 36th NFL season.
How did NFL Films start?
NFL Films started back in the early 1960s when Ed Sable, who by the way was the one that actually hired me in 1979, when he had an idea to sort of merge sports and Hollywood filmmaking. That's really the initial premise that that Ed Sable had. So what he did is he went to the NFL and he basically presented an idea to Pete Rozelle and said, let me shoot a game, and it turned out to be a championship game, and present it to you, and we'll see where we can go with this. And Pete Rozelle, being the mastermind he was as far as public relations and understanding where the game could go through television, saw the potential in a company like an NFL Films, which is what ultimately happened, but it really began with Ed Sable in the early 1960s.
And his son assumed that position.
Yeah, when I started in 1979, Ed Sable, Big Ed, was still here. And as I said, he hired me, but Steve was sort of becoming the main guy, and Steve really ended up being sort of my mentor, my really good friend. I mean, it was a sad day when Steve Sable passed away.
Who put John Facenda, the voice of John Facenda, in there, and who did the music?
That was all Steve. Steve took the mantle from his father. I shouldn't say it was all Steve because I don't know before I got here how it all worked out specifically, but I know Steve really took that mantle of looking at presenting football on film as not just a sporting event, but with a sense of mythology, with a sense of Hollywood filmmaking. And he did not just want a sports voice, he wanted a voice that transcended sports. And fortunately in Philadelphia was John Facenda, whose voice sounded like it came down from the mountaintop. It sounded like he was reciting the Ten Commandments. And I had an opportunity to work with John Facenda before he passed away, and I don't know if you'd ever had a chance to meet him, but John Facenda was the nicest man you could ever possibly meet.
Yes, he was a member of the Lanark Country Club when I worked there as a busboy. So that's how I got to know him. You got to know him in a different capacity.
Right. And
than I did.
I actually was the last one before he got sick and passed away to work with him. We actually went out to his house on the main line, and he had a studio there, of course. But John was a terrific guy. But getting back to your point, I think it all came from the idea that we were going to present football at NFL Films not just as a game per se, as a sporting event, but we were going to take it to another level.
Did Ed Sable was it more of a vision, or did he actually have like a Hollywood background? Did he, or was this just something he said, hey, listen, here's a great idea, let's try to do this? Was that it?
I think Mr. Sable had a lot of variety in his background. I don't know specifically exactly if he was involved in Hollywood per se, but I think that in an ancillary way he was, and I think he just had the vision to understand how football, because don't forget, we're talking about the early 60s now, John, and you and I probably remember the early 60s, but football was not the number one sport in the country as it is now.
No.
Baseball was, and boxing was.
Right.
I think they were 1 and 2, quite honestly.
Right.
And
Well, your uncle was a famous boxing sports writer.
Obviously,
boxing writer.
But football was presented almost with sort of that file footage where it was high up. You just saw guys with helmets. You had no idea what they looked like. You had no real connection with football players.
Right.
And I think what Ed Sable did is he saw a way to sort of make the sport far more intimate for people, to give people kind of a personal stake
Sure.
in watching football, and that's really what NFL Films did. I mean, no one had shot NFL games with cameras that were on the field.
At that point.
At that
You're
point in time,
Sure.
right.
Yeah. Because you're right, everything you saw was above.
Right.
Right. And when you listen to the game on the radio, which is most of it was, the announcer would say, well, he's taking the ball and now he's running. Well, you didn't know who they were talking about. Who's he? You know, he's back to pass, and unless you knew who the quarterback was, there was never kind of an announcement made of who that person was.
And then, if I'm not mistaken, I think one of the first wirings we did was Sam Huff. And it was a film called The Violent World of Sam Huff.
Right. That was done like on a 60 Minutes type of show.
Yes.
Type of show.
Yes. And that even got everybody closer to the game, because now you could hear what happened on the field. You could see players up close. You could get the interaction between players. Right. The whole idea really comes down to the fact that if you feel a personal connection with what you're watching, you tend to be a whole lot more invested and interested.
Yeah. Just a note on the Sam Huff thing, even though he did play behind a legendary defensive line, and he was known as, you know, the piling on Sam, but that's enough.
I'll leave that to you, John.
No, well, but Bednarik was still a better linebacker anyway. Anyway, that's just
a Philadelphian at heart.
No, well, I can name a few others. You know, the guy in Chicago and
Dick Butkus.
Yeah,
he was pretty good.
Nitschke in Green Bay.
That's right.
Willie Lanier. But
that's
anyway,
right.
Anyway, so where does Greg Cosell come in now? You know, like you're from Amherst College.
I went to Amherst College.
Right. So you're are you a football geek?
Well, you know, it's funny you say that, because I grew up.
Don't be modest.
I grew up in Queens in New York. Okay, and the high school I went to, Francis Lewis High School, we did not have a football team. Space was at a premium in New York City, so there's not that many schools in New York City that play high school football. So I didn't grow up aspiring to play football, because there was no resolution there. I grew up playing baseball and basketball, and that's what I played in high school. And I was pretty good at both. Went to college, Amherst College, played basketball.
Do you go there? Were you a scholarship athlete?
Well, Amherst is Division III. There's no scholarships at Division III.
So it's
right.
Ivy League.
I did get recruited by Ivy League schools. Columbia really wanted me to go, but I didn't want to stay in New York City, so I ended up going to Amherst. But then when I got out of school, believe it or not, John, for 1 year I actually taught school in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, outside of Detroit.
Oh.
I taught American history, economics, and American government, and I was the assistant varsity baseball coach and basketball coach.
So you like baseball as well?
I did. Baseball was my sport growing up. I was an all-city baseball player in New York City when I was in high school.
Oh,
so
that's impressive.
And I also, and I don't know if you're a basketball fan, but in
I
high
am.
school I went head-to-head against Ernie Grunfeld. Do you remember that name?
Yes, they do.
Who went on to play at Tennessee.
Yes.
Part of the Bernie and Ernie show, and then
Yes.
played in the NBA for years.
There was a story done by him about him on ESPN.
The 30 for 30.
Yes.
Bernie and Ernie, right.
Yes.
So I, after a year in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, I realized I didn't want to teach, and I didn't really want to go into coaching. So I was looking for a job like everybody does when they're 22 years old. And at that point, you actually sent letters and resumes. It wasn't the world it is now.
Right, and people actually read them.
Exactly. So I must have sent 1,000 letters and resumes. And one of my roommates in Grosse Pointe was from Gladwin.
Oh.
And his dad told me about NFL Films, which at the time was at 13th and Vine. You may remember that.
Yes.
And I said, okay, what's another letter and resume? So I sent a letter and resume to NFL Films. I heard from them. They asked me to come in for an interview. I interviewed with Ed Sable and a gentleman who unfortunately passed away a long time ago named John Hentz, who was also one of the founding fathers of NFL Films. They called me a week or so later and offered me a job. And I took a job. I started, John, July 23rd, 1979.
Oh, that's only a few days ago.
Well, 36 years ago,
yes,
a few days ago.
36 seasons ago.
Yes.
Yeah, sure, but you just had your anniversary recently.
Yes, I did.
Yes, on July 23rd. So congratulations for that. So were you a football enthusiast, or because
I loved sports. I grew up.
That's what this does.
I grew up
NFL
with
Films.
sports.
Did Pete Retzlaff have some association with this? Was he part of
That
NFL
I don't
Films
know.
in any way?
I don't know, because look, when I started here, I was 22 years old.
Right.
So I was just coming into a company that was much smaller than it is now. There may have been 40 or 50 people. At the time, they could take a year and basically teach you, so I didn't really do anything for a year except learn. It was a whole different deal. And then I guess my so-called big break and what has sort of propelled my career was in 1984, Steve Sable, who'd obviously been watching me for 5 years here, came to me and said, you know, I think I've got an idea for a show, and you're the guy. And at that point, keep in mind, ESPN was still somewhat in its infancy. It had only been around for 5 years.
Yes.
So it wasn't the ESPN we know now.
Right, constant.
Right. I mean, they were still probably showing Australian rules football back in those days.
Oh, that's good, though. It's not bad.
Right, right. So he came to me and he said, you know, I've got this idea for a matchup show. And he said, I know ESPN will run it because they were looking for programming. And he said, you're the guy I want to do it. So he said, and this was what made Steve so great. He said, you just do it the way you want to do it. You run with it. Have fun. Do whatever you want to do. Just do it. And he must have seen something in me because I always, when it came to sports, I always thought the games intuitively. You know, like I said, I played. I was pretty good in high school. And I thought the games. And he must have seen that in me. And so football, I really liked football. Obviously, I was working at NFL Films because I liked all sports. But there was no such thing as a matchup show or any show that was X and O based at that time because the consensus was that people wouldn't really follow those kinds of shows. People didn't like sports that way. They just like sports to watch them and enjoy them. They didn't really want to see sports with the X's and O's. It would be too complicated.
When you watch a game, do you take copious notes?
No.
You don't do that?
I sit at home now on Sundays and I have DirecTV. I watch usually the Red Zone channel and I just let it roll over me because then I'll come in Monday morning at 6:45 and I start watching the coaching tape.
Do you get asked all the time about your uncle? About Howard Cosell?
No, you know, I did more and more years ago, but as you may or may not know, this past year, number of months ago, was 20 years since he passed away.
No, I did not know that.
So you have to remember for people, unless you're specifically interested in the broadcast field, for people who are 22, 25, they might not know who he is.
Right.
You know, so yeah, when I was growing up, I did all the time, and probably up until, you know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, sure. Now, he's more, it sounds crazy to say, but he's more of an historical figure than he is a present-day figure.
He, in my mind, he made Monday Night Football, turned it into what it is today. The other big event that made football in general was the Colts-Giants championship game. That, to me, was
that was the NFL Films. It was the precursor to NFL Films, but a gentleman named Art Spieler, who since passed away, a longtime Philadelphian, worked here at NFL Films for, I would bet, 40 plus years. I knew Art well. He shot, you know the famous winning touchdown, the ground shot where Amici goes right into
Amici touchdown.
Art Spieler shot that.
Yeah. At some point, did the power go out? Did the power go out in that game and then had to be plugged back in?
That I don't know. I just know the power. I just know the power went out at the Super Bowl when the Ravens beat the 49ers because I was there.
I guess I could ask you about that, but I won't. But there's always been conspiracy theories about that whole thing. There was always a thing that I heard that the power went out of the championship game of the Colts-Giants.
That I don't know.
And that was only momentary. And well, that was the first sudden death game.
Correct.
In a championship. And
correct.
People put their televisions on saying, hey, this game is going to go into overtime. And what was fascinating about that game, and I think I was 11 years old at the time. What's fascinating about...
I was 2.
Okay, so then you didn't see it from the same perspective that I did.
I didn't see it at all.
No, you didn't. No. Well, you may have seen it like in a chair, like a.
Well, I was probably wondering where my next bottle was coming from at the time.
Well, the thing about it is that Raymond Barry, the Giants couldn't stop him.
That's correct.
Anytime Unitas wanted to throw to him, he threw to him at will. There was no stopping it. And as great as that Giants defense was, that Colts offensive line was equally that good on that particular day. and it was a fascinating thing to watch.
Well, and Johnny Unitas is in many ways the father of modern day quarterbacking, because he and I spent much time talking with Bill Walsh about this, and I was very fortunate to get to know Bill Walsh pretty well. Johnny Unitas was really the first quarterback who understood the concept of sort of timing, rhythm, anticipation, elements of the passing game that have just grown and grown to where they now define NFL quarterback play. And really, Unitas to Berry, that was the first quarterback receiving tandem that did a lot of that, and they changed. You could argue Unitas clearly changed the quarterback position, and while Berry was not a fast runner, he was a terrific route runner, and he understood sort of the subtleties of the receiving position.
Yes, and I think he also had a limp. He may have walked with a lift in his shoe, and I think his shoes had that. But he was a phenomenal player, and he had wonderful hands. You do a lot of things with the NFL. You go to the combine every year?
I do go to the scouting. I've been doing it since maybe 1999, so it's been a while now.
Do you look at talent and do you have your own draft board in your own head about who you think should be drafted where? Or
I don't.
How does one go about doing that?
Here's what I do, and then we can talk a little bit more about maybe what teams do. I don't do draft boards, and I don't necessarily rank players. What I do is when the NFL season ends, I start watching college coaching tape, and I usually make it through about 300 players, and I watch at least 3 games of each player, because you have to get a feel for a player. You can't just watch one game. It might be his worst game of the year. You can't watch, it might be his best game of the year. But the way I do it is I'm looking for traits, attributes, and characteristics that I believe, based on 20 plus years of watching NFL coaching tape, will transition and project to the NFL. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm not necessarily interested in saying, here's my list of the 5 best receivers in this draft, because everybody's different and everybody gets used differently in the NFL, because coaches look at players to fit into schemes.
Well, I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, so
coaching and scouting
are in many ways 2 different things.
Yes, and the message has been loud and clear, starting with Parcells, then Belichick, and now it looks like Kelly. They want to draft the players.
Right. Well, it was Parcells who had that famous line at the press conference.
Yeah, I'm going to cook the meal.
I want to buy the groceries.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
But that's one of the main differences, John, between scouting and coaching. Is coaches in the NFL look to adaptability to their schemes, because a lot of people don't think about this, but coaches coach what they know. Okay, if you've grown up, and you've been a West Coast guy, like John Gruden, grew up in the business, and he's a terrific offensive coach, one of the best. He grew up in the business really learning and refining the West Coast offense, the principle. Now, that term's become overused, we know that, but there are certain principles.
It's like Xerox now.
Yeah, there are certain principles that clearly go with that. That's what John Gruden grew up with. So he knows that backwards and forwards. Now, I'm not suggesting he knows nothing else, but this is what he really knows. So when he looks at a player, he puts that player into his system. He doesn't put the player in a Mike Martz system, which is a different system, or a Don Coryell system, which is similar to Martz. He puts it in John Gruden's system because that's what he knows. So coaches look for adaptability to their systems and to their schemes. Scouts just look for talent, whether that's measurables, whether that's intangibles. There's many things they look for, but they're not specifically looking for scheme. Now, there's a lot of organizations, and there are a lot of people who believe this is the way it should work, John, where the coach sets the parameters and says, hey, these are the kinds of traits and attributes we want at every position. I remember a great story Bill Polian told me about when they hired Tony Dungy in Indianapolis. Tony was bringing in that Tampa 2 cover 2 scheme.
Sure. Yeah.
So for a week, 2 weeks straight, they had meetings every day in which Tony explained to everybody in the organization, the general manager, Polian, the scouts, everybody, all the necessary imperatives of each position in his cover two so they could go out and look specifically for those kinds of players. Because if you're going to play that system, you need players who fit what they're being asked to do.
Sure.
And that's why, for instance, a player they drafted, which I'm sure most people will know, was Dwight Freeney, was about a 260-pound, 6'1" defensive end from Syracuse,
right,
who most teams at the time would never have looked at as a first-round pick because they'd say, how can you play a 6'1", 260-pound guy at defensive end in the NFL? So that shows you that there really needs to be a meshing of sort of mindset and concepts between a coaching staff and a scouting staff.
Talk a little bit about them. You're very proud of the matchup show.
Oh, extremely proud.
Talk about that, if you will.
Yeah, well, I'm always uncomfortable talking about, things I think I do well.
Well, you're very modest, but don't be modest here
we
today.
created the matchup show.
You and
Steve Sable came to me with the idea, so he had the initial idea. I'm not taking credit for the idea, believe me. But then he basically put the ball in my court. And if I go back to the mid-'80s and look at some of those early shows, it'd probably be like a comedy routine now. I'd probably laugh at them. But it was all trial and error. And you go through the process, and we got the coaching tape in maybe 91 or 92, the All-22. And I took it upon myself because I felt that if I were to produce a show like this, I had to learn the game inside and out from the coaching tape. I had to really learn the game of football, not just from a fan's perspective, not watching it on television. I had to learn the game. And because I didn't play it, as I mentioned, for me, learning the game through the coaching tape became an intellectual and academic exercise.
And you have to be careful not to let your opinion bleed into it. It has to be more the facts.
Well, I thought I knew football until I started watching the coaching tape.
That's how I would. I would get victimized the same way.
I thought I knew it. Just like everybody thinks they know a sport,
right.
And then I started watching the coaching tape, and I was really fortunate. I was able to learn because it's an ongoing process. I didn't know what I was looking at, John, for 3-4 years. I mean, in a strict sense. I mean, yeah, did I know what I was generally looking at? Sure. But I didn't really know what I was looking at for 3-4 years, and I was so fortunate to learn from so many people on different sides of the ball, different offensive coaches, quarterbacks, defensive coaches, and to this day, I'm constantly learning, and I want to learn because the game is ever changing and ever evolving. But I am really proud of the fact that we took something, presenting football on television from an X and O standpoint. See, I never use the word complicated, I use the word detailed. It's not complicated because football is like any business. There's smart people in it, there's people who are of average intelligence, and then there are people who are not real smart. So it's not complicated, it's just detailed. Like any business is. If you're in the insurance business, hey, I don't know all the ins and outs of the insurance business. It's probably not complicated, you just have to learn it.
Right.
Football is just very detailed. So I've taken great pride, and with Ron Jaworski, who's I've been with since 1990, since he retired, with Merrill Hodge, who's been on the show since 1996. I've worked with Phil Simms. I've worked with Jackie Slater, a Hall of Fame offensive lineman.
Yeah, St. Louis
I know
Rams.
I'm leaving a lot of people out. I don't want to make this seem like a speech.
An award ceremony.
Right, exactly.
For the Oscars.
Right. But I've been so fortunate to have coaches come to NFL Films and sit down with me and spend days with them, watching tape, talking concepts. When I did this book with Ron Jaworski, which was probably now 5-6 years ago.
Which we're going to talk about.
I got a chance. I was the researcher, basically, so I probably spoke to 75 different people about football concepts. So you're always learning, and then you take that when you watch the tape and you try to apply it. But it's a never-ending process, John, believe me.
Talk about your book that you're very proud of, Games That Changed the Game.
Yeah, that actually grew out of the matchup show. Ron Jaworski and I sat here for years watching film, and Jaws would always say, there's got to be a book here. We sit here and we watch film and we talk concepts. We've got to figure out a way to present this in a book. And we sort of came up with this idea because we didn't want to make it seem like a college lecture where you go to class for 4 hours and you just read it and you sit and you feel like you have to take notes.
Sure.
So because then it would be almost too geeky to use that term. We had to figure out a way to present it in a manner that would be somewhat appealing. So we took 7 games that, and you could probably pick 7 other games, but we took 7 games that we felt were somewhat instrumental in the tactical evolution of football. And with coaches that were very instrumental in that evolution. And we presented it that way.
One of them has to be Bill Belichick.
Bill Belichick, Don Coryell, Buddy Ryan, Bill Walsh, of course, and we.
Did you have a conversation with Belichick?
I did. It was awesome.
Can you talk
It was
about
awesome. Well,
what can you tell me?
we had to do this book, the research, during the NFL season, which made it a little intense for me because obviously I have a full-time job. So I would have to come in every Saturday for 3 months from literally 8 in the morning till dinner time. And then Sunday I'd come in at 8 in the morning till maybe 1:45 before the games, and I would have to do all this research. But I also had to have a ton of phone conversations with the principals and other people. As I said, I probably spoke to 75 people, but Belichick I had to talk to during the NFL season. And it was the year they played in London. So they had played in London the previous Sunday, and the interview was set up to talk to him 5 days later on a Friday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm thinking, John, if he gives me 15 minutes, this will be great. So I had my list of questions. And we start talking, and I could tell pretty quickly that he's kind of relaxed. And it's probably because I wasn't asking him about a game coming up or about a game he just played or about his present team. You know, we were talking football history, tactical football history, which Belichick loves. So we're talking, and then I notice about 5-6 minutes in, he starts calling me by name.
He's calling you Greg.
He's calling me Greg. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, I think maybe we've just crossed a hurdle here. So we're continuing the conversation, and I'm sensing that there's a really comfortable flow going on here, and I'm thinking, okay, this is going to work out really well. But I'm still thinking 15 minutes, John. You know, why would I think any longer? It's Bill Belichick.
Right.
So we just keep talking
You're
and
lucky
talking
you got
and
that.
talking. Yeah, exactly. You know, we keep talking and talking and talking, and we're having an unbelievable conversation. I mean, he's doing most of the talking, obviously, because I'm there to learn from him and for him to tell me, answer the question, so to speak. But he went off on numerous tangents, and then, amazingly enough, as I said, we started the conversation at 5 o'clock. It's 6:30. An hour and a half later, we're still talking. And I'm starting to feel awkward. I'm starting to feel like, God, I got to get this guy off the phone. You know, because he's Bill Belichick. It's the middle of the season. So anyway, we ended up getting off the phone. But I realized that was just unbelievable. He just gave me an hour and a half of his time.
And if he weren't impressed, he wouldn't have talked to you.
Well,
He'd have gotten rid of you. Right.
and maybe that's true. But
no, I think you kept it going.
another guy, by the way, just very quick aside before we move on, is one of the sections in the book also is Dick LeBeau's zone blitz scheme.
Sure.
And I got to talk to Dick LeBeau as well.
He's another brilliant man.
And
a
a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
I hope he looks better than I do now, and he's about 77 years old.
Yeah, he's some really. Tell me about because I know you're pressed for time, and I appreciate your giving me the time. What's the other project you're working on?
Well,
The Game's Greatest?
Here's what I do during the summer. During the summer, I basically do two.
Besides wear shorts like me? We're both
Exactly.
wearing shorts there.
No, I'm
Right
glad
on,
I can
right
do
on,
that.
Right on.
During the summer, I do 2 things for the most part. I work with Ron Jaworski. He does. We do something called Jaws Quarterback Countdown, which airs on ESPN. And right now, it's in the middle of being shown. I can't tell you, the final list because
that's
I think they're up to maybe number 12 or 11. So I can't tell you the top 10. But I work on that, and I really enjoy that. And then for the last 10, 12 years, we have another series we do for ESPN called Greatest Games. And I've done one of those each of the past 10 or 12 summers. And I really enjoy that because most of them are games played, they're not played in the 60s or 70s, but they're games that are usually 10, 15 years old. And I get a chance to go out and talk to a lot of former players, former coaches, and I love those conversations. And these are really lengthy, detailed interviews, usually 45 minutes to an hour. And once guys are retired and they have a sense of reflection, and obviously they're more fully formed as human beings when they're 45 or 50 as opposed to 25, you really get great answers, and you have great. I really try to do these interviews, John, almost like we're doing. Let's have a conversation.
Yeah.
You know, I don't sit there and go, okay, my next question is.
Right.
I just try to have a conversation.
Yeah, I wrote no notes for this conversation. All right, one last question, I'm going to let you go. We sit around every Sunday and we watch football, and we say, if you had one game to win, who would you want? Van Brocklin, Montana, Brady, Unitas? Who would you want? One game to win.
You know,
are you free to?
Well, those are bad questions to ask me, and I'll tell you why. Because to me, there's so many variables in football that, you know, it's like when people love lists. So people want, who's the best quarterback? Give me your top 5 this.
Yeah, I didn't ask those questions.
I have a hard time with that. I mean, you know, I really do. You know, I would tell you that the quarterback that I probably loved to watch the most was Dan Marino. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you he's number 1. You know, he didn't win a Super Bowl. And yes, does that have to factor into someone's evaluation? Sure it does. But I'm also very leery of just counting Super Bowls as the basis for.
Yeah, me too.
Because then it's just a mathematical equation. Then all you're saying is, okay, if they won X number of Super Bowls, they're the greatest quarterback ever. Yeah. That's not the way I see the game. I see the game in a subtle, nuanced way, you know, as a craft. I don't just see it as, oh, he won a lot of games. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons why guys win a lot of games.
Yeah, I had a great time.
Hey,
I really appreciate you giving me the time. This is John Ricciutti with my friend Greg Cosell from Radnor Studio 21 on location at NFL Films. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you.